Rahman Idris was a wealthy 60-year-old businessman searching for love, while Elara Mendis, a 27-year-old beauty from Sri Lanka, was searching for a way out of her struggles. But when their lives collided in a whirlwind marriage, it unleashed a dark chain of lies, betrayal and murder that would leave an entire community shocked. Rahman Idris had lived a long life of hard work, building his name and fortune through decades in the shipping industry of Penang. At 60 years old, he had everything most men desired: wealth, a respected reputation, and a sprawling house that looked out toward the coast. Yet within the walls of that house was a silence that grew heavier each year. His wife had passed away nearly a decade earlier, and his only daughter, Nadia, had chosen to live independently in Kuala Lumpur, distanced from her father, not by anger, but by the growing gap of lifestyle and choices. Rahman filled his days with work, business dinners, and the company of colleagues, but the nights were the hardest. Loneliness became a constant shadow, one that whispered louder with every passing birthday. It was during this stage of his life that Elara Mendis appeared. She was a striking woman of 27 from Sri Lanka, someone Rahman met at a charity dinner hosted by an old business associate. Elara's beauty was undeniable. Her long black hair, sharp features, and poised confidence drew eyes wherever she went. For Rahman, her presence was more than just attractive. It was refreshing, almost intoxicating, like a sudden breeze cutting through the stagnant air of his routine life. She spoke with charm, her laughter was light, and she carried herself with the grace of someone who understood the power of appearances. Their connection was swift. Rahman began inviting her to dinners, then to weekend outings, and before long, their photographs started appearing in the social circles of Penang. Friends and acquaintances whispered their doubts, some behind Rahman's back, some more direct. They asked why a young woman would attach herself to a man so much older, one who had already lived the prime of his years. Rahman ignored them all. For the first time in years, he felt alive again. Elara brought warmth to his home, color to his otherwise gray life, and a promise of companionship he had almost given up on. Nadia, however, was unconvinced. From the moment she met Elara, she sensed something beneath the polished surface, something rehearsed about the way she smiled and spoke. She warned her father, gently at first, then with more urgency, that he should be cautious. Rahman dismissed her suspicions as jealousy or generational misunderstanding. To him, Nadia was simply too protective, too unwilling to let him be happy after years of grief. Elara, on the other hand, played her role perfectly, attentive, affectionate, and eager to be seen as the devoted young wife who adored her aging husband. The wedding was quick and understated, yet it made the newspapers for the unusual match. Elara moved into Rahman's grand residence, a home lined with expensive furniture and filled with reminders of his late wife. Slowly, she began replacing those reminders with her own touches. New curtains, new decor, and new routines filled the household. Rahman saw it as a rebirth of his home, but Nadia saw it as an erasure of the past. What disturbed her most was how comfortable Elara seemed in her new surroundings, as if she had been preparing for this transition all along. Despite her doubts, Rahman's world appeared bright. He was no longer the lonely man wandering through a silent house. He had a wife to accompany him at events, a partner to share meals with, and the illusion of a future that felt hopeful. But beneath the surface of this newfound joy, subtle cracks were already forming. The warmth Elara radiated in public sometimes cooled when no one was watching. Her eyes, so full of charm at social gatherings, occasionally reflected detachment when Rahman spoke about his dreams for their future. These moments were fleeting, easy for Rahman to dismiss as the natural rhythm of marriage. What Rahman failed to see was the sharpness in Elara's calculation. She was attentive, yes, but selectively so. She asked careful questions about his businesses, his properties, his account. She listened intently whenever discussions of inheritance or financial planning arose. For Rahman, it was evidence that she wanted to be part of his world. For Elara, it was information pieces of a puzzle she was quietly assembling. The community around them continued to some pitied Rahman, believing he had fallen victim to a woman far younger, who sought nothing more than comfort in his wealth. Others envied him, admiring how he had managed to find love again at an age when many lived alone. Rahman clung to the second narrative, convincing himself that he was blessed, that he had been given a second chance at happiness few were ever granted. In the quiet corners of the house, however, the shadows lingered. Nadia's visits grew more strained as her mistrust deepened. Elara's phone buzzed with messages that Rahman never saw, and though the man of 60 believed he had escaped the grip of loneliness, he had unknowingly stepped into a web spun carefully by hands far younger, far hungrier, and far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. The first few months of Rahman and Elara's marriage unfolded smoothly, almost too smoothly. The household, once marked by silence and stillness, now echoed with movement and color. Yet underneath the surface of this seemingly harmonious new chapter, the shadows of doubt began to stir. Rahman, at 60 years old, had long prided himself on his ability to manage his business empire with precision. He was a man who studied details, who noticed patterns, who could sense when something in his company was slightly off. In his home life, however, he deliberately ignored those instincts, convincing himself that his marriage was beyond suspicion. Nadia, on the other hand, was not willing to ignore the signs. She visited often in the early weeks, watching Elara closely, searching for inconsistencies in her behavior. What she noticed unsettled her. Elara rarely spoke about the future, never once asking about plans for travel or family. Instead, her interest seemed to hover around matters of lifestyle and possession. She admired jewelry, inquired about business ventures, and displayed more curiosity about bank accounts than about family history. To Nadia it was transparent, but to her father, these were signs of an eager young wife trying to build her place in his life. One evening, Rahman noticed something unusual while reviewing his monthly accounts. Small sums of money had been transferred out without his direct knowledge. They were not large enough to be alarming, but they were odd, recurring amounts sent to unfamiliar accounts overseas. He mentioned it casually to his accountant, who suggested it might have been an error. Rahman let the matter rest, though a flicker of unease remained in the back of his mind. The unease deepened when he overheard Elara late at night speaking on the phone in hushed tones, using a language he could not recognize. Her tone was not the gentle affection she showed him during the day, but sharp, fast, and deliberate. When he asked her the next morning who she had been speaking to, she smiled lightly and claimed it was her mother. Rahman accepted the explanation, telling himself he was being paranoid. Yet the memory of her urgency on the phone gnawed at him. As weeks turned to months, Elara's independence grew. She would leave the house for hours, sometimes under the pretense of shopping, sometimes to meet friends he had never been introduced to. She always returned with a smile and carefully prepared stories of her outings, stories that seemed too perfect to be spontaneous. Rahman wanted to believe her, so he did, though a heaviness began to settle in his chest whenever she walked out the door. Unbeknownst to him, Elara's activities were carefully coordinated. She maintained constant contact with Victor Dean, a man who had once promised her the life she desired. Their relationship had never ended. It had merely been repurposed into a more strategic partnership. Victor encouraged her to gather information about Rahman's wealth, reminding her of the long-term plan they had built together. Through encrypted messages and late-night calls, they plotted step by step how she would secure financial stability and eventual permanent residency. Meanwhile, Nadia's concerns escalated. She noticed her father's demeanor shifting, more distracted, more troubled, though he refused to admit it. She also noticed Elara's subtle disdain for family traditions, her reluctance to join cultural gatherings, and her coldness when discussions turned toward legacy or inheritance. Nadia voiced her worries again, but Rahman dismissed them, too embarrassed to acknowledge that cracks were appearing in the life he had so proudly rebuilt. The turning point came when Rahman stumbled upon one of Elara's handbags left open on the couch. Inside was an envelope filled with receipts and bank slips, many tied to transfers he had not authorized. His hands trembled as he realized the amounts matched the missing sums from his account. Still, even in the face of this evidence, He tried to rationalize it away. Perhaps she was supporting family overseas. Perhaps she felt too shy to ask him directly. His desire to believe in the marriage outweighed his instinct to confront the truth. What Rahman did not know was that the scam was already unfolding around him. Victor and Elara were growing bolder, their conversations less cautious, their planning more aggressive. For Elara, every passing week brought her closer to her goal. For Rahman, every passing week pushed him further into a dangerous trap built on charm, secrecy, and betrayal. The cracks that had begun as faint lines in the foundation of their marriage were spreading wider, and soon the weight of deception would shatter everything. Rahman thought he had regained. Rahman's instincts, long ignored, could no longer be silenced when he uncovered the truth tucked away in his own home. It was an ordinary evening when he searched through a drawer in Elara's dressing table, looking for a misplaced pen. What he found instead was a thin folder, hidden beneath scarves. Curiosity made him open it, and in that moment, the carefully constructed illusion of his marriage came crashing down. Inside the folder was an unsigned application for permanent residency, listing him as her sponsor. His name had been written clearly across the documents, but nowhere did he recall ever agreeing to such a plan. Alongside the application were photographs that burned his eyes. Pictures of Elara with another man, a stranger to him, their intimacy captured in smiles and gestures that had no place outside of betrayal. The man in the photographs was Victor Dean, though Rahman did not yet know his name. He only saw the evidence of deceit, proof that his wife's affection had never been real. Each image was another blade, slicing through the fragile trust he had held onto. The rage was immediate, but beneath it was a deeper wound, one of humiliation and deceit. He had been blind, willingly blind, while she spun her web around him. His marriage, the second chance he thought he had been given, was nothing but a performance designed to strip him of dignity and wealth. For days afterward, Rahman moved like a shadow in his own home. He said little to Elara, watching her instead with silent intensity. He noticed what he had previously ignored, the way her eyes flickered toward her phone at every vibration, the brief but satisfied smirk that played on her lips when she checked messages, the absence of real warmth when she touched him. Her laughter now sounded hollow, rehearsed, and her words seemed no longer directed at him, but at the life she was planning beyond him. Rahman began to follow her discreetly, his suspicion feeding on itself. He saw her meeting strangers at cafes, exchanging envelopes, speaking in hushed tones before slipping away. Once he watched from his car as she embraced the very man from the photographs. The sight confirmed his worst fears and burned itself into his memory. The truth was undeniable. Elara was living a double life, and he was nothing more than a stepping stone. In the solitude of his room, Rahman pieced together the story, the bank transactions, the late-night phone calls, the unexplained absences, everything connected. He realized he had been funding her future with another man, transferring money that was quietly drained from his accounts and funneled into places he could not trace. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was financial, emotional, and personal. The very foundation of his trust had been weaponized against him. Nadia noticed the shift in her father. He had grown quieter, more withdrawn, though she could not yet see the storm brewing inside him. When she pressed him, he avoided her eyes, unwilling to confess the depth of his humiliation. Rahman was a proud man, and admitting the truth meant acknowledging not only his wife's betrayal but his own blindness. To him, that was unbearable. Instead, he carried the weight alone, each day sinking deeper into anger. What he did not know was that Elara and Victor were accelerating their plan. They had grown impatient, eager to secure enough funds to disappear together. The documents Rahman had found were only the beginning. Hidden elsewhere were tickets, correspondence, and carefully timed arrangements. Elara's role as a devoted wife was nearing its end, and she knew it. Her performance around Rahman grew sloppier, the cracks widening as her attention shifted fully to her escape. Rahman's discovery, however, changed everything. The quiet man who had once sought comfort in companionship was now consumed by a burning sense of betrayal. Each day he spent under the same roof as Elara felt unbearable. Every glance at her face, a reminder of how completely he had been deceived. The anger inside him was no longer just a reaction, it was building into something dangerous. He told himself he needed proof before confronting her, but deep down, he knew the truth had already crossed the line of no return. The man who had built his life on discipline and restraint, now found himself unraveling, step by step in the grip of a betrayal so cruel it would push him to the darkest place he had ever known. The night that would forever alter Rahman's life began like any other, with the heavy humidity clinging to the walls of his house, and the stillness of the evening wrapping around the empty room. Rahman had returned home earlier than expected, his mind restless after a day of silent fury and suspicion. He had grown used to watching Elara's movements carefully, noting the irregularities, but what he found that night was not another small clue, it was the undeniable confirmation of everything he feared. Elara was in the living room, her suitcase open on the floor. Clothes were folded neatly, tucked away with the kind of precision only seen when someone intends to leave without looking back. Her phone lit up on the couch beside her, buzzing with messages that flashed Victor's name across the screen. She moved with urgency, gathering jewelry and documents, her mind clearly elsewhere. For Rahman it was the final betrayal made visible. The woman he had welcomed into his home, trusted with his name, and believed to be his second chance at happiness, was preparing to vanish. Rahman stood in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. All the fragments he had collected, the missing money, the photographs, the late-night calls had built to this moment. The reality of her intentions was no longer a suspicion, but a tangible fact. He was nothing more than a transaction to her, a stepping stone toward a life with another man. The humiliation swelled inside him, mingling with grief, fury and a desperation that overwhelmed reason. The confrontation that followed was not one of words. Years of loneliness, months of deceit, and the crushing weight of betrayal exploded into violence. Rahman's anger surged uncontrollably, his hands fueled by the rage of a man who realized he had been played for a fool. The room echoed with the chaos of the struggle, furniture knocked askew, the silence of the house broken by the sound of destruction. Elara, unprepared for his fury, had no time to defend herself. In a matter of minutes, the young woman who had once seemed like salvation lay lifeless on the floor, her suitcase half-packed beside her, a grim symbol of her escape plan cut short. When the rage subsided, Rahman stood trembling, staring at what he had done. The reality of her betrayal had pushed him to an act he had never imagined himself capable of. His hands, his clothes, and the once pristine floor now bore the evidence of a life taken in violence. The suitcase lay open, its contents spilling out like a cruel reminder of what she had intended to do. For Rahman there was no victory in what had happened, only emptiness and horror at the irreversible line he had crossed. Panic quickly set in. Rahman scrambled to cover the evidence, wiping surfaces, moving objects, attempting to erase the chaos of the struggle. Yet no matter how hard he tried, he could not undo the damage. Blood had seeped into the carpet, leaving stains that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove. His trembling hands left smudges in places he failed to notice, and his hurried movements only made the scene more suspicious. The house, once a symbol of wealth and order, had transformed into the setting of a brutal act that could not remain hidden forever. Through the windows, the neighborhood carried on as if nothing had happened. Lights flickered in nearby homes, cars passed by on the street, and the distant hum of life outside contrasted sharply with the darkness inside. Rahman's wall. He felt as though he had stepped into another world, one where time no longer obeyed rules and consequences loomed like shadows he could not escape. As the night wore on, Rahman sat in silence, staring at the body of the woman who had undone him. The man who once prided himself on control and dignity was now broken, consumed by an act of irreversible violence. He had destroyed the very thing he thought he wanted, a partner, a companion, a cure for loneliness, and in its place was only tragedy. He did not yet know how quickly the truth would come to light, or how thoroughly his life would unravel, but in his heart, he understood that nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after the killing, the house felt different. It was no longer the elegant residence of a respected businessman, but a place heavy with dread. Rahman had not slept, his eyes fixed on the lifeless body that lay in his living room. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the faint hum of the ceiling fan, and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards under his restless pacing. He had tried to think of solutions, but none made sense. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like an immovable stone. He knew that his life, once built on order and reputation, was slipping into ruin. By mid-morning, neighbors began to notice something was wrong. A few had heard strange noises the night before, muffled crashes, and a sudden silence afterward. When Rahman failed to appear at his usual morning walk or greet the gardener as he always did, whispers began to circulate. It was not long before someone reported unusual activity at the house, prompting the police to investigate. Detective Farid Qasim was assigned to the case, a man known for his sharp instincts and methodical approach. When he arrived at the scene, the house appeared deceptively normal, but the air inside was heavy with tension. Rahman, pale and trembling, tried to compose himself as he answered the door. His attempt at calmness did not convince the detective. The sharp eyes of Farid caught the small details, the faint metallic scent in the air, the hurried arrangement of furniture, the discoloration on the carpet, where something had clearly been cleaned. These were signs of a story waiting to unravel. As the search began, it did not take long for officers to uncover the truth. Behind the closed door of the living room, they found Elara's body. The suitcase beside her made the scene even more telling. To Farid it spoke of intention, of a plan interrupted in the most violent way. The room revealed not just the act of killing, but the desperation of someone trying to erase the evidence of their crime. Rahman broke down when confronted. Years of discipline and pride collapsed into tears and incoherent words. He confessed in fragments, admitting the betrayal, the rage, and the overwhelming humiliation that had driven him to violence. For the detective, the case was more than just a killing. It was the story of a man deceived and a woman whose ambition had led her into dangerous territory. As the investigation unfolded, more details emerged. Elara's phone contained hundreds of messages with Victor Dean, each one a piece of the puzzle. They spoke of plans to siphon Rahman's money, of the documents prepared for her permanent residency, of the future they intended to build together once Rahman was discarded. Victor had encouraged her at every step, reminding her of the wealth within her reach. To the police it was clear that Rahman's suspicions had been justified. He had been the victim of a calculated scam, but his response had turned him from victim into criminal. The news spread quickly, shaking the community. Some sympathized with Rahman, believing he had been pushed to the edge by a cruel betrayal. Others condemned him, saying no amount of deception could justify the act of taking a life. For Nadia, the pain was double. She had warned her father, but she had never imagined it would end in such tragedy. She lost not only the chance to expose Elara's deceit, but also the father she knew, who was now destined for a prison cell. In court, Rahman's case became a spectacle. His age, his reputation, and the details of Elara's scam painted a complex picture. The judge and jury listened as the prosecution laid out the brutality of the act, while the defense spoke of manipulation, loneliness, and despair. The truth was undeniable. Elara had betrayed him, but Rahman had chosen violence instead of walking away. When the verdict came, Rahman was sentenced to life imprisonment. As he was led away, he did not fight. The man who had once lived with wealth and respect walked into his punishment quietly, burdened by regret. His legacy was destroyed, his freedom gone, and his daughter left with the memory of a father who had fallen to both love and rage. The case closed with haunting questions left behind. Was Rahman truly a monster, or was he a broken man who succumbed to betrayal? Was Elara only a victim, or was she the architect of her own downfall? The story ended not with justice or redemption, but with ruin on all sides, a chilling reminder of how love twisted by greed and lies can turn into tragedy.